The unexpected visitor. The first indication that Jackson Reed's life was about to change forever wasn't the strange lights in the sky or even the distant rumble that rattled his windows. It was the sudden silence that followed. The crickets stopped chirping. The night birds went quiet. Even the old maple tree outside his workshop stopped its familiar creaking in the wind. Jackson lowered his soldering iron and removed his magnifying glasses. At 43, his eyes weren't what they used to be, especially after years of squinting at circuit boards and microchips. He glanced at the ancient wall clock, 11:37 p.m. Too late for hikers, too early for the local teenagers who occasionally wandered onto his property looking for thrills. Probably just a transformer, he muttered to himself, returning to the disassembled drone on his workbench. The county's power grid was as reliable as a politician's promise, especially during summer storms. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic clicking that didn't belong to any woodland creature he knew. Jackson grabbed his flashlight, hesitated, then picked up the baseball bat he kept by the door. Living alone in the foothills of the Cascades made caution a habit, not paranoia. The night air carried the scent of ozone and something else, something acrid that burned his nostrils. Jackson swept his flashlight across the tree line, its beam catching nothing but shadows and undergrowth. He was about to turn back when he noticed the scorched path cutting through his wild raspberry bushes. "What the hell?" he whispered, following the trail of flattened vegetation and blackened earth. It led deeper into the woods, away from the access road and toward the creek that marked the boundary of his property. The clicking grew louder, interspersed now with what sounded like labored breathing. Jackson tightened his grip on the bat and rounded a large boulder. That's when he saw it, or rather, her. The figure was humanoid but clearly not human. Slender and tall, at least 6.5 feet, with skin that seemed to absorb and reflect moonlight in patches of iridescent blue. Instead of hair, a crown of crystalline structures curved around an elongated skull. The being lay half submerged in a creek, one arm clutching what looked like a shattered device embedded in its chest. Jackson froze, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The creature's eyes snapped open, vertical pupils dilating in irises the color of amber, and fixed on him with startling intelligence. "Please," it said, the word emerging as much from the device in its chest as from its lipless mouth. "Shelter. Danger follows." Jackson Reed had spent the last 5 years avoiding human contact after the accident that took his wife and career. Now, faced with something decidedly not human, he found himself unable to turn away. "Can you walk?" he asked, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. The creature attempted to rise, then collapsed back into the water with a hiss of pain. The device in its chest sputtered, emitting sparks of blue light. "System compromised," it managed. "Repairs needed." Jackson sighed, setting down his bat. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered, wading into the cold creek. He helped the alien to its feet, noting with surprise how light it was despite its height. Its skin felt like fine leather stretched over ceramic. "My workshop's closer than the house," he said, guiding the alien through the woods. "And probably has more of what you need anyway." The creature leaned heavily against him, its breathing shallow and irregular. The clicking sound, Jackson realized, was coming from something embedded in its wrist, a transparent panel that pulsed with faint light. "I'm Jackson," he said, feeling absurdly like he should introduce himself. "Jackson Reed." Designation. "Nix," the alien replied, the translation device making the name sound both mechanical and melodic. "Archivist. 3rd Fleet." "Well, Nix, you picked a hell of a place to crash. Nearest town's 30 miles away, and I haven't had a visitor in." Jackson trailed off, calculating. Almost 3 years now. Fortunate coincidence, Nix replied. Isolation, preferable. They reached the workshop, a converted barn filled with workbenches, salvaged electronics, and half-finished projects. Jackson cleared a space on his couch, a relic from his previous life that he kept meaning to throw out but never did. Nix collapsed onto it, the crystals on her head dimming slightly. Up close, Jackson could see that what he'd taken for clothing was actually part of her, sections of hardened exoskeleton interspersed with more flexible tissue. "What happened to you?" Jackson asked, gathering his first aid kit. It seemed woefully inadequate for the task at hand. "Pursued," Nick said, her voice stronger now that they were indoors. "My ship detected Earth's technological emissions. Primitive but sufficient for emergency landing." "Gee, thanks," Jackson muttered, examining the device in her chest. It resembled nothing so much as a mechanical heart, wires and tubes extending from it into her body. One section was clearly damaged, a hairline fracture leaking a phosphorescent blue fluid. "This is beyond superglue and duct tape," he said. "What is this thing anyway?" "Translation matrix. Life support. Memory core." Nix's amber eyes fixed on him. "Without repairs, I will cease functioning within your planetary rotation." Jackson ran a hand through his graying hair. "You're asking me to fix alien technology I've never seen before to save your life, all while danger follows. Did I get that right?" Nix's expression didn't change. Jackson wasn't sure if her face could express emotions as humans understood them, but she inclined her head slightly. "Yes." Jackson looked around his workshop. 5 years ago, he'd been one of the leading robotics engineers at Nexus Technologies. Now he repaired drones and built custom electronics for paranoid preppers who paid in cash. His life had shrunk to this property, these tools, the quiet solitude of days spent tinkering and nights spent drowning memories in cheap whiskey. And now an alien was bleeding on his couch. "I need to know what's chasing you," he said finally. "And why?" Nix's chest device flickered. "Hunters. Revisionists who would erase history. I safeguard truth. You're going to need to be more specific than that." Nix raised her wrist, and the transparent panel projected a holographic display into the air between them. Jackson stepped back in shock, then leaned forward in fascination as images appeared, star maps, what looked like spacecraft, and humanoid figures similar to but distinct from Nix. "My species spans multiple star systems," she explained. "We have existed for millennia, spreading knowledge and preserving histories of worlds. Some factions now believe certain histories should be edited. Removed. They would rewrite the past to shape the future." "And you disagree," Jackson said, beginning to understand. "I am sworn to preserve truth, not curate it," Nix replied, and for the first time, Jackson detected emotion in her voice, a fierce determination that transcended the mechanical translation. The display changed to show a smaller craft in pursuit of what must have been Nix's ship. "They followed me through 3 systems. Earth was not my intended destination, but damage forced landing. They will trace my signal. They will come." Jackson nodded slowly, his mind already cataloging the components he might need, the modifications he'd have to make to his equipment. It had been years since he'd felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with an impossible engineering challenge. "How long do we have?" "Hours. Perhaps a day." Nix's amber eyes met his. "You will aid me?" Jackson picked up his most precise set of micro-tools and set them beside the couch. "I spent my career building machines that could think like humans," he said quietly. Never thought I'd be fixing an alien who thinks like a machine. He reached for his diagnostic tablet, a customized device he'd built for his more delicate work. Let's see what we're working with, shall we? As the night deepened around them, Jackson Reed felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident: purpose. Whatever was coming, whatever danger Nix had brought to his doorstep, he was done hiding from the world. Even if that world had suddenly become much, much larger. Secrets and signals. The dawn light filtered through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across Jackson's cluttered space. He hadn't slept. For hours, he'd worked methodically on Nix's damaged translation matrix, his fingers moving with a precision he'd thought long forgotten. Scattered around him were cannibalized parts from his own projects, microprocessors, copper wire, and components he'd modified beyond their original purpose. Nix watched him with those unnerving amber eyes, occasionally directing him through the holographic display on her wrist. The technology was beyond anything he'd ever seen, yet strangely intuitive once he understood the basic principles. Your species relies heavily on silicon-based computing, Nix observed as Jackson soldered a connection. Inefficient, but impressively adaptable. We make do with what we have, Jackson replied, not looking up from his work. Not all of us can have fancy crystal computers embedded in our skulls. Bioneural interfaces, Nix corrected. The crystals you observe are external manifestations of internal processing structures. Jackson paused, looking up at her. You're saying those are, what, your brain showing through your skin? A simplified explanation, but essentially correct. Nix tilted her head, the crystals catching the light. Your discomfort is unnecessary. Is your brain not visible through your eyes? Jackson blinked, then let out a rusty laugh. I suppose when you put it that way. He returned to his work, connecting the modified power source to the damaged matrix. The crack in the device had been sealed with a mixture of epoxy and the phosphorescent fluid, which Nix had instructed him to collect and filter. Attempt activation, Nix instructed. Jackson connected the final wire and stepped back. The matrix hummed, vibrating slightly before settling into a steady, pulsing rhythm. The blue glow strengthened, and Nix's posture immediately straightened. Functionality restored to 83% capacity, she announced, the mechanical quality of her voice diminishing. Sufficient for immediate needs. You have considerable skill for a technologically limited species. You're welcome, Jackson said dryly. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the small refrigerator in the corner of his workshop. I need coffee and food. You need, what exactly? My systems can synthesize energy from various sources. Sunlight is preferable, but electrical current is acceptable. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You photosynthesize and can plug yourself in like a toaster. Convenient. My biological functions are considerably more complex than your bread heating device, Nix replied, but there was something in her tone that might have been amusement. Well, Miss Complex Functions, you should probably know we have bigger problems than your power source. Jackson gestured toward the window. Outside, in the clear morning light, a thin trail of smoke still rose from the direction of the creek. That crash site of yours isn't exactly inconspicuous. If your hunters don't find it, local authorities eventually will. Nix's crystals dimmed slightly. You are correct. The wreckage contains traceable components. It must be neutralized. Neutralized how, exactly? Self-destruct protocols would have activated upon impact, but the damaged matrix likely prevented complete dissolution. Nix rose from the couch, steadier now but still moving with careful precision. We must return to the site and activate the emergency purge manually. Jackson ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Great. Alien tech demolition before breakfast. Just how I planned to spend my Sunday. They made their way through the woods, Jackson carrying a backpack with tools and Nix moving with increasing confidence as her systems stabilized. The morning was quiet, with only the occasional birdsong breaking the silence. Your isolation is self-imposed, Nix said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Jackson shot her a glance. What makes you say that? Your dwelling contains advanced equipment alongside primitive living conditions. You possess skills that indicate professional training, yet you live without connection to your species' social structures. This suggests voluntary withdrawal rather than necessity. Jackson's jaw tightened. Maybe I just like my privacy. Privacy and isolation are not synonymous. One is a preference, the other is a punishment. Nix's amber eyes studied him. Who do you punish, Jackson Reed? Yourself, or others? Before he could respond, a high-pitched whine cut through the air. Nix froze, her head tilting upward. Down, she hissed, pulling Jackson behind a fallen tree trunk. A moment later, something passed overhead, a metallic sphere about the size of a basketball, its surface rippling with an effect that seemed to bend light around it. It moved with deliberate slowness, scanning patterns visible as faint projections beneath it. Seeker drone, Nix whispered. Scout class. It tracks energy signatures and transmission patterns. I'm guessing it's not looking for squirrels, Jackson muttered. It cannot detect us if we remain still. Its sensors are calibrated for active technology. Nix's chest matrix dimmed to almost nothing, the glow suppressed. Do not move until it passes. They watched as the drone completed a sweep of the area, hovering momentarily over the path they'd taken from the creek the night before. Jackson held his breath, acutely aware of his thundering heartbeat. After what seemed like an eternity, the drone shifted direction and continued its search pattern away from them. That, Jackson said when he dared speak again, was definitely not one of ours. The revisionist faction employs autonomous seekers as their first wave. Nix stood carefully. They will send more. Increasingly sophisticated. They reached the crash site, which in daylight looked less like a dramatic impact and more like someone had dragged a metal object through the undergrowth. The creek bed contained scattered fragments of what might have been a craft, though nothing larger than Jackson's hand remained intact. I don't see a spaceship, Jackson said, looking around. My vessel was designed for single-occupant atmospheric entry. Most of its mass was converted to energy during the controlled disintegration. Nix knelt by a particular cluster of fragments, some still faintly glowing. The core remains, however. It contains navigational data that could reveal my previous locations. She began gathering specific pieces, arranging them in a pattern that made no sense to Jackson. From a compartment in her exoskeleton, she extracted a small crystal similar to those on her head and placed it in the center of the arrangement. Stand back, she instructed. The purge will release a moderate electromagnetic pulse. Jackson retreated several paces. Define moderate. Your primitive electronic devices within 50 meters may experience temporary disruption. My truck's parked further than that, right? Assuming your vehicle employs standard combustion technology, it should be unaffected. Nix pressed the crystal, which began to pulse rapidly. We have 90 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. They hurried away from the creek, climbing the small ridge that led back toward Jackson's property. Behind them, the crystal's pulsing intensified, visible even through the undergrowth. Perhaps I should have mentioned, Nix said as they crested the ridge, that the electromagnetic pulse will be accompanied by a visible energy discharge. You mean an explosion, Jackson translated flatly. A controlled energetic event. An explosion, Jackson repeated, just as a blinding flash of blue-white light erupted from the creek bed. A shockwave of air hit them moments later, strong enough to make the trees sway but not knock them down. Where the fragments had been, a perfect circle of ground was now scorched black, steam rising from the creek. "Was that controlled enough for you?" Jackson asked, brushing dirt from his clothes. "The dissolution was successful," Nix replied simply. "However, it will have been detected by any nearby seekers." As if on cue, the high-pitched whine returned, this time from multiple directions. "Back to the workshop," Jackson said urgently. "We need to move. Now." They ran through the woods, no longer concerned with stealth. Jackson led them on a winding path, deliberately avoiding the clear trail to his property. They emerged from the trees near his storage shed, a dilapidated structure he used mainly for junk he couldn't bear to throw away. "Wait," he said, pulling Nix to a stop. "The drones are looking for energy signatures, right? The workshop is full of powered equipment." "Correct. It would be the logical search target." Jackson pointed to the shed. "Then we don't go to the logical place. Those things may be advanced, but they're still following basic search parameters. We need to think like humans, not machines." Inside the shed, dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the weathered boards. Jackson moved quickly, pushing aside old furniture and boxes until he reached what he was looking for, a trapdoor in the floor. "Root cellar," he explained, pulling it open. Previous owner was a bit paranoid about the Cold War. Built this as a makeshift fallout shelter. They descended into a cool, dark space lined with concrete blocks. Jackson hit a switch, and a single bulb illuminated the small room. Along one wall stood shelves of dusty mason jars and canned goods, along another, an ancient ham radio set and what looked like military surplus equipment. "Not exactly five-star accommodations," he said, "but the concrete and soil should mask any energy signature from your matrix. And those seekers will be looking for something more sophisticated than a 60-year-old bunker." Nix examined the space with what might have been approval. "Primitive, but effective shielding. The principle is sound." From above came the now familiar whine of seeker drones, closer and more numerous. "They're expanding the search pattern," Nix said quietly. "The hunters themselves will not be far behind." Jackson sat on an old metal folding chair, suddenly feeling the weight of his sleepless night. "So what exactly happens when these revisionist hunters find us? I'm guessing they don't just ask you nicely to come along. They will attempt to extract my memory core and destroy my consciousness," Nix said with disturbing calmness. "Any who interfere will be neutralized." "Neutralized," Jackson repeated. "There's that word again." "Killed," Nix clarified. "They will kill you, Jackson Reed." He stared at her for a long moment, then laughed without humor. "You know, 5 years ago I was designing robotic limbs for veterans and children with disabilities. Now I'm hiding in a root cellar with an alien librarian while space fascists try to hunt us down." He shook his head. "Life takes some unexpected turns. You have not asked why they pursue me with such determination," Nix observed. "I figured you'd tell me when it mattered." "It matters now." Nix's amber eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "What I preserve is not merely history, Jackson Reed. It is evidence of first contact between my species and another. A peaceful species that was subsequently erased." Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. "Erased? You mean?" "Genocide," Nix confirmed. "The greatest crime in our collective history, buried beneath revisions and lies. I carry the last untampered records. The last proof. Above them, the seekers continued their methodical search, their whining growing more distant as they moved away from the shed. But they would be back, Jackson knew. And next time, they wouldn't be alone. "We need a plan," he said finally. "And I need more coffee."